So in the fall of 1962, 50 years ago, the world came closest to what could have been a full-blown nuclear war. At that time, between the United States and the then Soviet Union. Now, the context to this was that the Soviet Union had moved nuclear-capable missiles to an island called the Bay of Pigs just off the coast of Cuba. The United States, when it discovered this, was obviously livid. The then US President John F. Kennedy, in a counter move, moved American missiles to the southern coast of Italy, as well as placed missiles in Turkey, threatening Soviet territory. It led to a fierce contest for over 10 days. It was an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation, which is now famously called the Bay of Pigs episode. At that time, John F. Kennedy, the US president, stood his ground against the Soviet president, Nikita Khrushchev, and then finally, after about 10 days or so, both sides agreed that they will de-escalate. It was a Soviet side which said that they will withdraw the Soviet-made missiles away from Cuba in return for guarantees and a written assurance from the United States that it will never invade Cuba. Also, the US stood down its missiles in Turkey as well as in the southern coast of Italy. Now, this episode is playing itself out 50 years on with roles reversed. Russia is the one that's now threatening to attack US positions in Latin America, most notably in Cuba and in Venezuela. And it is the US which is threatening to move in defensive forces in Ukraine, just on the western side of Russia, if the Russians were to move and attack the eastern part of Ukraine. On this week's Crux Decode, we'll try and analyze if the Bay of Pigs episode is repeating itself 50 years down the line with roles reversed between the United States and Russia. For a number of months now, Russian President Vladimir Putin has made it clear that for him, securing the periphery of Russia, particularly on its western edges, in the border with Ukraine as well as in the Caucasus, is of utmost concern. It is a core concern, the way Vladimir Putin says it. And topmost there, as far as priorities go, for him, is that the United States and its Western allies should not expand their footprint into Ukraine. Now remember, Ukraine has been speaking to the United States and its Western partners for a number of years to become a full-fledged NATO ally. This is a red line, a total red line for Vladimir Putin. In fact, over the last year or so, since Joe Biden became president, first when they had their in-person meeting back in the summer of 2021, and then later in December when they had a 2-hour-long virtual summit, that's Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Joe Biden, Ukraine was the single biggest point of disagreement between Washington and Moscow. The United States believes, and they say that they have their military radars and satellites that have picked up the movement of Russian troops, up to 100,000 troops moving into the Donbass region, just on the eastern periphery of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin says the red lines for him are twofold. Number one, that Ukraine should never become a full-fledged NATO ally. And number two, the United States should move away offensive weapons that it has placed in Ukraine. Now, what exactly is going on here? Just a few days ago, we had the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov suggesting that if the United States thinks that the Russian influence or the Russian interest is only in Ukraine, then they need to think otherwise, because he, according to him, quote unquote, refused to rule out the possibility of Russia moving assets to places where it can hit the US fast. Obviously, he was referring to places in Latin America like Cuba and Venezuela. Now, there are a number of experts in the United States who believe that this is simply bluster, and they have very good reason why they suggest that this is simply bluster and that the United States needs to call out Vladimir Putin's bluff. The number one reason they suggest that this is the case is because A, Russia does not have the military capability today that it did in 1962 to have offensive weapons placed either off the coast of Cuba or in Venezuela. The geopolitics has completely changed over the last 50 years. And the second big reason that they cite why this can't be done is because back in 1962, when the Bay of Pigs episode happened, Russia was arguably the biggest economic power in the world. At that time, it was perhaps even a bigger economy than the United States was in 1962. But today, Russia is a pale shadow of its former self, economically speaking. Today, it's not even in the top 10 economies of the world. It's behind Brazil. Its economy is probably the size of South Korea. So it is really an economic midget compared to the United States, which of course is the world's biggest economy right now. So economically speaking, it would simply not make sense for Vladimir Putin to attack the United States in the event that the US moves in troops into Ukraine for Ukraine to defend itself if the Russians were to attack the eastern part of Ukraine. So there is one school which suggests that yes, this is bluster and that the United States needs to call off this bluster. The problem for the US is singularly this, that Putin has used this playbook in 2014. If you remember, in 2014, Crimea, according to the Russians, was always part of the Russian Federation, as it were. So this was unfinished business, and the Russians used the pretext of chaos and disorder. There was a revolution that was going on in Ukraine at that time. The Russians suggested that the Crimeans are not interested at all in being associated with Ukraine anymore. Russia sent in troops and annexed Crimea, and the world could pretty much not do much about it. Now, people like Jake Sullivan, who is the United States National Security Advisor, is suggesting that Putin is using the same playbook in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. So these are cities like Donetsk and Luhansk, where there are people who are upset with Ukraine, who do not want to be associated with Ukraine, and Russia, of course, is happy to foment these divisions. Sullivan suggests that Russia is following the same 2014 playbook where they create these divisions, where they create a sense of unrest amongst the people and use that as a pretext, use that as an excuse to walk in and annex this particular Donbass region, much like what they did with Crimea. The question, though, is how can the United States ensure that this does not happen? The only way militarily it can do that is by giving military aid as well as defensive weaponry to Ukraine, both of which it has done over the last few weeks. At the same time, there have been a number of high-level engagements, not just the summit-level meeting that happened between the two presidents, but there have been numerous meetings at the level of the Secretary of State, at the level of the Deputy Foreign Ministers, at the level of the National Security Advisors, but none of these negotiations between American and Russian officials have led to any kind of breakthrough as far as the question of Ukraine is concerned. So in this eventuality, what is likely to be the most or the likeliest course of events over the next few weeks? If Vladimir Putin feels that there is no question that NATO or the United States will agree to not making Ukraine a full-fledged NATO member, and there is no way they'll agree to removing these offensive weapons from Ukraine, then it's possible that he could use the pretext of some kind of unrest in the eastern part, in the Donbass region, and invade Ukraine. In that event, because the United States and its allies have very little military leverage. Yes, they have economic leverage, and already we've seen a series of sanctions that have been imposed, but very little military leverage, because otherwise it is going to lead to a full-fledged war between Russia and the United States, and that is something that no country wants at this given point of time. The biggest losers will, of course, be the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people, because this will be the second time round that the Russians have used a playbook in which they've nibbled away at Ukrainian territory, first Crimea and now Donbass, where they've nibbled away at Ukrainian territory, thereby rendering Ukraine that much more vulnerable to Russia's machinations.